Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce distinguished Professor Emerita E. Kaplan. She is the past and founding director of the Humanities Institute at Stony Brook University and past president of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies. She is a scholar of trauma studies, feminist film theory, and gender studies, among other fields. We've been planning to discuss now Voyager for a few years now, but the pandemic and other unforeseen events led us to postpone till now. So it's a real treat that you can believe that we've discussed this quite a lot. There are two broad areas of questions that I want to address and hope that Ann and I could discuss tonight. First, the long-standing scholarly interest in this film, since released in 1942, but still very much and consistently of interest to scholars and historians. And secondly, the status of now Voyager of a film of its time. For instance, how is now Voyager a war film, and what can we glean from its exploration of illness and trauma and mothering? So let me start with the first question. So, released in 1942, now Voyager was made when the U.S. was at war. Later the same year, and people in the audience will know, Paul Reed and Claude Rains, who played Jerry Doriance and Dr. Jack within this film, were featured in Casablanca, which was rushed into release to take advantage of the publicity from the Allied invasion of North Africa a few weeks earlier. It had a world premiere in November of 42 and was released nationally in early 1943. Now, so we have now Voyager a little bit earlier than Casablanca, same year. But how might we think of its status as a war film? There's no war present. It's not like Casablanca. How would you talk about this as a war film, or a film made during the war?
Well, obviously, literally, it's not a war film in terms of soldiers and battles and so on. But on the other hand, it's made in a context where the American culture was extremely destabilized. The entry into the war, as you said, is just going on. And there's an incredible uncertainty, and the destabilization, particularly of gender, with the women leaving home and going to work in the factories. And so we have in the film this old culture, this house that's like a museum rather than a house, or a mausoleum, I nearly said. And it's clearly on its last legs, and Lisa and June are already beginning to bring new ideas and to butt convention. So I see this as sort of the war context coming into the way the film is set up in terms of the house and the Boston culture. But there's another very interesting sort of a link to the war, which is that Betty Davis, actually I found an article written in September 1942 talking about Betty Davis hieing down to Joplin, Missouri, to manage these incredible crowds to promote war bonds. She was the only white member of Hattie McDonald's African-American war bond organization. She set up a Hollywood canteen for the service people, and she was in general very much involved in the war effort. I thought that was very interesting. On the one hand, she's playing this role,
right,
and at the same time, really very much involved in the war context.
Well, let's shift a little bit to the novel on which this is based, and this is Olive Higgins Prouty's novel written in 41. And as we've discussed between us, the movie remains pretty faithful to its source.
Very
the novel is considered to be one of the first, if not the first, fictional depictions of psychotherapy on screen, which is depicted fairly realistically at the time, as Prouty herself spent time in a sanitarium following a mental breakdown in the 1920s, 1925. What can you tell us about Prouty and the depiction of psychiatry in this film?
Well, first of all, you're right. It's an unusually early depiction of psychoanalysis, but it's not the first in terms of cinema in general. Secrets of the Soul, the Pabst film in Germany, made in 1926, is a sort of little mini, I don't know how many people know the film, a little lesson of Freud's classical psychoanalytic theory. We have a very warm-looking therapist talking with the hero of that film. But when the Hollywood got fixated on psychoanalysis between 45 and 50, the representation was not of anything like in the now Voyager film, but was classic psychoanalysis with a therapist-patient, intense relationship, transference, counter-transference, making it very dramatic. And of course, film noir followed with those sorts of scenarios. So you think of The Snake Pit, 1948, or even better, Spellbound, 1946, where you get, because another stereotype of the psychoanalyst was to make him sort of seem to be a mini Freud, so with a little German, heavy German accent and sort of, you know, a august presence. But this is quite different in Now Voyager, and I think quite unique. And of course, here comes the role of Olive Prouty. Olive Prouty was a wealthy woman, lucky to be living in Massachusetts, because at that time, in the early, turn of the century, and the wealthy people were wondering what to do about mental health in their communities, and were donating money to set up private hospitals to service the wealthy people who needed it. One of these hospitals was called the McLean Hospital, founded in 1811. And McLean, and it's still going today. Another one in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, was the Austin Riggs Center for Psychoneurosis, which was, I believe, Cascade in the film is modeled on Austin Riggs, because all that I've written about it sounds exactly like Cascade. The theory now being that people should be removed from home, the home environment, should be living in nature, should be eating healthy food, should be making artworks and helping in the community, that healing was taking place more through the environment than through, you know, the classic therapist-patient relationship. So I think Olive Prouty herself must have gone to the Austin Riggs Center, but very interestingly, there's this link with Sylvia Plath later on, who I think went to the McLean Hospital, at least first. But Olive Prouty had also gone to Smith College, and she was giving fellowships to students, to prospective students, and she made sure Sylvia Plath got one of these fellowships and helped get her into the better institution for her mental, to help her with her struggles. Plath didn't return the compliment, by the way. Those of you who know the novel, she has a Philomena Guinea in there who's modeled on Prouty, and Plath puts down this writer for being too popular, for a sort of a high culture snobbery. And I think actually Prouty may have fallen between stools, because on the one hand she was not a popular writer, but she wasn't a, quote, canonical writer, and sort of got trapped between being judged from either side. But she was a remarkable, prolific novelist. This novel is the third in 5 about the Vale family. Also, very recently, a whole omnibus has been published, which contains 3 of her novels, a big fat book this big. So she's finally, and there's also a feminist press issue with an afterword by Judith Main, feminist film theorist. So she's sort of coming into her own. I mean, it's not that she's been totally ignored, but I think there's a lot more to say about Olive Prouty.
Interesting. Well, turning back to the film, let's talk a little bit about Dr. Jackwith and following up on the psychiatry theme. As a psychiatrist, he describes his work famously in this film as helping people who don't know which way to go, but putting up a signpost saying, not that way, but that way, as he explains to Mrs. Vale. And yet, he also claims, he doesn't put much faith in scientific terms, but leaves that to fakers and writers of books. So I don't think he was talking about Prouty. But what do you make of this representation of psychiatry in the film? He's obviously not a Freudian figure, but what would you say?
Right. Well, I think it's a very modern idea of a therapist, actually. As I was reading and watching the film again, I was thinking about relational therapy, which is now au courant, in New York, particularly in New York City. He's very practical. He is very self-assured, but humble. I think that opening sequence, the way he handles himself and Betty Davis as this traumatized, terribly depressed young woman, is excellent. You see him looking at everybody, his eyes darting. He looks concerned. He looks serious. He makes the one slip, which actually makes him more human, to have noticed her cigarette butts in the wastebasket when he's going to pick it up to wrap his little box in. But he smooths that over, and I think it does brilliantly in facing Mrs. Vale and simply telling her she's ruined the daughter. He couldn't have done better to ruin, to have spoiled the child, and hurt her completely. So I think in the novel, we learn a lot more about Jackwith. There's an extended discussion of his New York office. Charlotte is impressed with how unfancy it is, how simple it is, how even a little dowdy it is, and showing he's not out for materialistic things, that he's mainly concerned to help people. So he's made a very sympathetic and I think quite realistic. He in fact, to get back to Secrets of the Soul, he reminds me of the analyst in that film, although the technique there is classical Freudian.
Right.
And Jackwith is absolutely the opposite. The other wing of things that we should just bear in mind at the time are the asylums, and because the funding was for they were very expensive to go to these hospitals and the private ones. Finally, in the 30s, they started to set up state institutions, and I think we all know what happened with those, because money ran out, and before you knew it, they were putting people who were homeless, criminals, people who had mental issues, all in the same institution. And in fact, Mrs. Vale, I don't know if you caught it, she says, when Jackwith says she needs to go away from home or to a sanitarium, she says, I suppose it's one of those high wire fences with yowling inmates.
Right.
So, I mean, there is that wing obviously psychiatry and psychoanalysis and mental health was very divided at the time and across the different institutions. But Olive Prouty was lucky to be where she was and to have the wealth to help her through her tragedy. The tragedy was she lost two children early in life.
Yeah.
In their lives, and
Yeah.
she finally had a breakdown in 1925 and went to, as I say, I'm pretty sure it was the Austin Riggs Center.
That's interesting. Well, you've written a lot, extensively, in fact, about motherhood and representation. In an essay from the mid-1980s, for instance, you trace a history of maternal sacrifice in classical Hollywood film. But you say that it had all but exhausted itself when Now Voyager was released in 1942. So like the Stella Dallas model has been superseded. How has your thinking changed or evolved on questions of mother-daughter relationships in this film? I mean, do you see Now Voyager as initiating a kind of shift in that representation, or at the end of a trend, or?
The representation of motherhood in the film is very much linked to Philip Wiley's monstrous mother. Mrs. Vale is a monstrous mother, absolutely dominating her daughter, traumatizing her daughter, bullying her, and really it's abuse, actually. And I would say that's an unusual representation. That's not usual. But very interestingly, right now, if you think about film like, well, Mommy Dearest was probably the latest for a monstrous mother per se. But if you think of a film like The Lost Daughter, which also is shocking in terms of a mother daring to leave her child, but we see it from the point of view of the heroine, of the daughter.
Well, as you and I have talked about various mother-daughter pairings in this film. Obviously, Mrs. Vale and Charlotte, Jerry's wife and Tina, Charlotte and Tina, and so on. And I'm wondering, there's intergenerational trauma here around mothers and daughters, however figured. And one thing, I don't know, and maybe audience members will have something to say in our Q&A, but one thing that there's a couple cringe-worthy moments in this film, and one for me is when Jerry comes to the Vale Mansion, which has now been utterly transformed. We'll talk about that in a minute, and Charlotte's coming down Tina's mid-stairway, and do you like me?
Yeah.
And he looks at Charlotte and says, "I love you," and then the passing on of the name, and I use our special name, Camille. And there's this way that the child, Tina, seems like this pawn or this figure between these two people who can't speak. And it seems, she's being kind of manipulated. Okay, but of course we know that she's happier. She's even become glamorized in the process. The house is a place for her. But I wonder what you'd say about like intergenerational trauma and its...
Well, actually thinking about intergenerational trauma, let me just go back to the pairings, because there are three pairings. One we don't really see, which is the Isabel-Tina one. And that's where it seems to me there's intergenerational trauma. Clearly, this Isabel, from what we can gather, is extremely narcissistic. She cannot attune to her daughter. She is jealous of the daughter because lacking the mother, Tina turns to her father, and then Isabel gets jealous. So you wonder what happened to Isabel to produce this kind of effect in terms of Tina. You could say the same with Mrs. Vale, although she's so monstrous that even the idea of making her some sort of a victim is a problem. But again, you see these patterns repeat itself over each of these couples. And the progressive mothering is, of course, Charlotte and Tina, and that comes about because of Charlotte drawing on her own experiences as brought up by a victim of a monstrous mother, so she can use her psychological knowledge that she's got from Dr. Jackwith to help create the bonding with Tina. Now that moment that you were mentioning is very awkward, and it feels as if they are exploiting Tina in their looking over each other and saying, I love you. Right. But I think that the following sequence is where I think it represents Charlotte not yet having decided properly which she does want to sacrifice. She knows she's got to sacrifice either Tina or Jerry, mothering or sexuality, and that look is when she's still undecided. By the end of the film, she's made up her mind. She's going to sacrifice her sexuality for the pleasure and the duty, in a certain sense, to help Tina grow up. So it's sort of it becomes more clear and less exploitative, I think, by the time you finish the film.
Yeah, as I said, it was just that one moment where you think. Anyways, I wanted to, as I said at the beginning, this is a film, and there are a few of them in our field. There are a few films that get returned to again and again and again. And what struck me about Now Voyager is obviously in the 70s and 80s, feminist theorists were very interested in this film. There's so much writing, whether from a historical point of view about consumer culture and Maria Laplace, or a kind of close textual reading in Camera Obscura by Leah Jacobs, and more recently Patty White, who does a kind of queer reading of the film for the Criterion Collection. And on the other hand, we have like film philosophers, Stanley Cavell and others, who are also very interested in this film, but they're not interested in questions of mothering or gender or representation. They're interested in more the Walt Whitman aspect, the kind of voyage of self-discovery. I wonder what you would say. Why do you think this is a film that has sustained interest over so many decades by scholars?
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. First of all, I think the themes of mother-daughter relationships that we've been talking about, of sacrifice, of questions of patriarchy and women's freedom or not freedom, have always, since the Industrial Revolution and since bourgeois culture got started, have always interested audiences. And the male establishment always rejects these films, calling them women's weepies. But the audience knows what they like and what they want and what they can get from the films they watch. Just wanted to say that, because I forgot to say it earlier, that what's very interesting is the way the romance narrative is sort of what is on the surface of these films, but underneath there are these issues we refer to as belonging to the women's film, looking from the point of view of how women are treated in culture and society and in the private domestic scene. So I think these themes are one thing that keeps a film like now Voyager and their attractiveness to people, keep it going. Secondly, the strength of the performances. I mean, Bette Davis just amazes me what she's able to do in this film. And she's on screen nearly the whole time. So she has to change from the despecularized, dowdy, medical gaze of the beginning of the film through to the re-speculization, making her object of the male gaze. I mean, it's a huge range of emotions she has to perform. And the other act we were talking about, Gladys Cooper, is brilliant here.
Plays Mrs. Vale, the mother.
Go from the actress to the role. Mrs. Vale, the mother, absolutely incredible how she makes her stony face and her cold, ice-cold eyes. And Jacquith, I think Rains does a very good job too. They all were nominated for an Oscar for this film, along with Max Steiner for his wonderful score.
Well, it's also the movement, the narrative movement from illness to romance to motherhood to health. And this, even, the butterfly motif and this whole idea of becoming and self-reliance and becoming oneself. And, I think that's the film philosopher's interest.
Yes. By the way, I think the Whitman, I think Prouty herself was very clever in a way in highlighting the Walt Whitman poem. But I'm sure that gave the film a sense of being, if not high art, being serious art.
Right.
So I think it gives it a sort of cachet. And I think the male philosophers chose to write so much about that film, partly again, because Walt Whitman has given it a signature, right? It's okay to study this film. Walt Whitman is in it. So
it's after higher things.
Yes, that's good.
All.
That's very nice. Yes. It's after higher things.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the Vale Mansion, but it's a part of a larger thing that, the film, in the tradition of women's films and women's fiction, features before and after, even with her feet, coming down the stairways, first the dowdy shoes and then the fashionable shoes. And so there's a lot of repetition in this way of before and after. But one of the most striking things is how the Vale Mansion becomes a character in this film. As it opens, it's raining, and it rains the whole time. It's a lot of rain. There's a lot of sadness around and coldness of the Vale Mansion. And at the end, of course, it's animated. There's a fire. We know she's lit the fire earlier on. but
Right.
they're, you know, roasting weenies and canapes and, you know, eating on the floor, and it's this festive. So I wondered if you'd say more what you think about the setting and the Vale Mansion
yeah.
and the film's turn at this time. Again, wartime. It reminds me of Mildred Pierce, which is the film is very different than the novel on which it's based. But this whole kind of turn and celebration of middle classness, a kind of middle class, down to earth, is apart from this.
Right.
So I wondered if you.
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that the film, with Charlotte's taking over the house, transforms it from the dying, outmoded, sort of semi-Victorian, stuffy kind of culture with repression and hostility and discipline and such things, to something loose and joyful and productive. And I thought you were going to mention the scene with Dr. Jackwith, which is part of he's the one who first comments on the house.
Right,
and
sturdy, strong.
Proud of itself, standing up there, but it's about to fall down, as it were. But no, yes, it is wonderful the way she opens it all up. Young people coming and going, dancing going on. You know, there's many, many rooms, so there's plenty of room for everybody to be enjoying. And I think it shows the journey of the film, you know, through the house.
Well, and perhaps it's a big topic, but I think there's something, even as feminist scholars have celebrated the film, and largely because of Charlotte and herself, learning her self-reliance, independence, and that, you know, what most women want is a man of their own, a home of their own, and a child of their own. And she voices it in her inner monologue that this is something she knows she should want. But, you know, she turns down Elliot Livingston ultimately. There's that fabulous scene where he's got his arm around her and he's patting her like, you know.
When she says, "Take me somewhere, be gay, make love to me," his arm goes right out like that.
Yeah. So, I mean, but so the fantasy in the end, of course, she can have a home of her own and a child of her own, and the fantasy of this relationship that she schools Jerry, who's out of character, starts acting patriarchal at the end instead of indulging her in the way she sees this as a way to be with him and with his child, and they both can raise her. But the premise is what pervades the film, more so than even something like Stella Dallas. There's so much sexual repression. I mean, it's all based on what you can't have is sexuality.
Yeah. Well, you can't particularly have sexuality and be a mother. I mean, this is where the film, this is an old stereotype of mothers and sexuality. We know from the history that motherhood in the United States was linked to the Christian discourse, and they had to be pure, virginal, domesticity, submissiveness, sitting in the role of the mother to nothing else. The European discourse, starting with Rousseau, arguing that the mother should provide education for the boy, of course, to become the model citizen, also was taken up in the United States. But these myths die so hard, and Olive Prouty herself seems to support, and this is where she's conservative, having been very progressive in terms of mental health institutions. She's conservative in not seeming to see a problem, because the film doesn't show any much problem of her giving up sexuality. That one moment actually with Elliot Livingston is the sexiest moment, you know, in the film, and he's the unsexiest person possible, the least sexiest person. So is where you get a feeling she seems to have a feeling for sexuality in that scene. But when the film comes, but it's like lost. She needed an excuse not to marry Livingston and found a good one, but then seems able to just drop the sexuality once Tina comes in the mode. So the mother has to sort of transfer sexuality to the bond with the child, it seemed, in the myth. that goes
I hear
on.
you.
Yeah.
Well, one critic has written of the film's ending that Charlotte and Jerry may have a child together to raise together, but Charlotte and Dr. Jackwith, who are going over plans to add a wing to his retreat, have a life together. What's your view?
Yeah, I think that's that short scene really, where they're sitting cozily together, going over the maps. It's to base that whole argument on such a small evidence throughout all the other relations. I was watching particularly carefully, given I wanted to think about that question, the film again. Jackwith is always totally, quote, proper, appropriate, as not in many of the film noir films. The analysts do not keep their distance necessarily. So I think, yes, we don't know how their lives will go on, and they do seem particularly close. But I see that scene more as really important for making the claim that Charlotte will not only be just a mother,
right.
She will also be guiding the new wing for children in Cascade and going over, being a business partner, really. Of course, it's her money that's going to fund the wing to the Cascade extension. And I think we think about, let me just throw something else out. I think we think there must be some sort of sexual relationship with Jackwith because it's so common in those film noir from the 48 to 50, where the analyst, often it's the woman analyst, as in Spellbound, who falls in love with the therapist, or in The Snake Pit, where it's the woman who falls in love with the analyst, which is interesting, of course, the gender.
Right.
The woman would be the one to be fragile enough to, fall in love with her therapist. But I think we think about it because that's such a common trope across these films.
Well, I have a final question. It's really big and unfair because it's a big question, but you can take a small approach to it. But can you say more about how you think views of mothering and representation have changed over time? Since this 1942 moment to our own time, and what differences we're seeing, or are really stuck in the same loop?
Yeah. Well, let me just say, first of all, I would never write a book about white motherhood. And there are so many different kinds of mothers across ethnicities, nationalities, cultures. It would take an army of scholars to really answer the question and really analyze what's going on with cross-motherhood. But sticking to the white discourse, which does still dominate the screens, although there are more more films showing other cultures and worries about mothering. And I'm thinking of Jacqueline Rose's book, a new book on motherhood. She calls it Motherhood, an Essay in Cruelty and Love. And she returns to the 70s scholars and writers who were the first to try to break the myth about motherhood, the idealized mother. I'm thinking of Jane Lazar, and I'm thinking of Dorothy Dinnerstein and Sarah Ruddick, and also my own work from that period. And it's now as if the wheel has turned again, and scholars are beginning to notice again that nobody can speak the truth about motherhood, which is why The Lost Daughter, is important, but also sort of shocking, because we hold the mother still as this, as Rose puts it, that the mother has to, and so did Dorothy Dinnerstein, that the mother has to become the scapegoat, and she's responsible for humanity's failures. It's all because of the mother that, things are not going well, and so the mother is made the scapegoat. So sticking to the white discourse still, there are a number of new themes, not new per se, but there's lesbian motherhood in The Kids Are All Right with Annette Bening. There's the Ladybird, the teenager rebelling against her mother, the kind of conflicts that go on through that. There's the Buddies sort of scenario, and the eternal daughter, in a certain sense, I put in, well, it's not quite the buddies, but the daughter so unwilling to leave her mother, so wanting to please her mother, so wanting to sort of cling on to her, is another kind of newish theme that's going on. So, yes, very complicated to
But
study,
I hear what you're
study.
saying, that what you would do differently than the work that you did.
Yes, I would immediately, I think it's lucky in the book I did discuss the two versions of imitation of life, and I think that's a good example of how race impacts relationships, how it's completely different conflict. Both the white mother and daughter have conflicts, and the African-American mother and daughter, but the nature of the conflict is so determined by the racial context and the racial situation in a racist nation.
Right.
The mother responds one way, the daughter responds another way, but it's all around how they perceive their possibilities given the culture that they live in. So that's the kind of thing I would want to tease out in any future work. Right.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anne, for having this conversation tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Well, thank you, Patrice, for your good questions.
Yes.
Thank you.